markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Not much movement in stocks. This is Traders Weigh the latest economic data for any clues on where interest rates would be headed. Initial jobs claims show the labor market is cooling kind of gradually rather than quickly slowing. Then you had U.S. manufacturing activity. That shrank at the fastest pace this year. And then existing home sales, that increased for the first time in 5 months. Investors, of course, also looking ahead to Fed Chair Jay Powell's speech tomorrow. So right now we have the NASDAQ, little change, down about 6 points. The Dow down about 0.1%, 63 points. The S&P 500, little change, up just a fraction. Well, the two-year yield, 3.99%. That's up 6 basis points. A yield on the 10-year, 3.85%, and that's up 5 basis points. We have spot gold lower, $2,477 an ounce. Brent crude, $76 a barrel. WTI crude, $72 a barrel. We have the dollar stronger, Japanese yen, euro weaker, British pound stronger. Bitcoin right now down 1% at 60,000. And finally, some news from McDonald's. The Wall Street Journal says it plans to invest $1.3 billion in the UK and Ireland over the next couple of years. It's opening new restaurants there and creating 24,000 jobs. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Jess.
All right, very good. Lisa Mateo, thank you so much. Jess Menton sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well. And if you're listening to us in Boston, our new home starting September 3rd will be 92.9 FM. That's the day after Labor Day. Bloomberg Radio moving to 92.9 FM in Boston. Looking at Peloton, the stock's up 25%. I mean, the loss narrows. I guess sales came in a little bit better than expected. A pretty decent profit outlook. So I guess a turnaround plan here that people have been waiting to see some positive effects. Maybe that's actually happening here. Again, stock up 25%. So let's check in with Geetha Ranganathan. She's a media analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. She joins us from Princeton via that Zoom technology thing. Geetha, what did you make of the Peloton's results? And is a 25% move higher? Is that warranted?
Yeah, I don't know about that, Paul. I think 25% might be a little bit of an overreaction. But then again, remember, it's down from, you know, what was it trading at 160 or something during the pandemic?
167 at the beginning of 2021.
Yeah, 167 during, yeah,
That's when I was on the bike.
Right.
Yep.
So that's a drawdown of close to 100%, Geetha.
It definitely is. But, you know, you're absolutely right, Paul. So there definitely were some green shoots from the fiscal fourth quarter results. I mean, up till this point, I think Peloton's management was really trying to do too many things at once. So they were trying to reinvigorate subscriber growth, and at the same time, they were also tasked with, you know, reducing costs. And of course, those two are kind of a little bit incompatible because you need to kind of run promotions, you need to undertake a lot of marketing spend to you know, kind of re-energize subscriber growth, and those two are just so incompatible with each other. So obviously now they're just focusing on the cost element of it. They're really right-sizing their cost base. What we're seeing is, you know, strong discipline across the board. And with that, we've seen not just an increase in their profitability for the quarter that they reported, but also their guidance for fiscal 2025 was super encouraging. So their adjusted EBITDA forecast came in almost twice or double what, you know, consensus was expecting. But again, Paul, as we kind of think about the longer term strategy here, the question is, I mean, can there really ever be a turnaround in the true sense of the word? Meaning, you know, can demand inflect? And so far, you know, what management said and all the signs that we're seeing is the visibility is extremely limited. So yes, we can have some short-term gains in terms of, you know, the profit metrics, but the long-term metric, which is really revenue and subscriber growth, I think that's going to continue to be challenged.
Looking at that all-time closing high, so it was January 13th, 2021, $167.42 there. You look where it's trading now, $4 and about 15 cents there. But when you're talking about this turnaround strategy, Paul and I earlier were talking about he has a couple different products from Peloton, but usually he's mentioning his girlfriend uses them more now than he does. But how do you get, as from a shareholder type perspective, because when you have an inflection point like COVID, obviously this was a stock that was one of those types of darlings, though. What, when it comes to demand, like you were talking about, how do they rectify that, and how do shareholders really view it? Because how do you get that stock back to even eclipse 167?
It's going to be very hard, Jess, to kind of get it back. And remember, this is a company that is in transition on many different fronts. So they actually do not have a CEO right now. So the CEO search is ongoing. So they're doing everything that they can right now, at least to kind of right the ship. So headcount reduction, marketing expense reduction. Obviously they're closing a lot of the retail showroom space, inventory. They're kind of right-sizing that. So they're doing everything that they can, but if you kind of look out at the long term, like what is the business model? Like we do need some kind of clarity on that. Do they get into different, modalities? I mean, they're principally really just a bike company. Even the treadmill really hasn't taken off in a big way. And even with their hardware, yes, obviously they're one of the best connected fitness products out there, but they've had problems with recalls and that kind of causing churn. So, again, will like getting into different modalities like the rower or even strength training, will it really kind of move the needle? I'm not necessarily sure, which means that the only other option for them is to really find a buyer. And there have been some rumors that, private equity companies might be interested. But then if private equity gets involved, then it really comes down to, trimming the costs even further and just it kind of becomes more about like just extracting whatever cash you can from the company.
Hey, Geetha, let's switch gears to Paramount. It looks like we may have a bidding war there. Mr. Edgar Bronfman upped his offer today. What's the feeling about Paramount and how this might play out?
So it's getting very interesting, Paul, and I'm not really sure what Bronfman's endgame is here. So obviously he wouldn't get involved at this, kind of at this late stage if he didn't get some encouragement, in my view, from Sherry Redstone. And again, I'm not really sure what Sherry Redstone wants here. I mean, she ultimately kind of calls the shots. I don't know whether she's doing this because she wants Skydance to kind of sweeten their deal. Obviously, the $15 per share for the public shareholders was not something that sat well with them. Bronfman has kind of upped that a little bit. It's a $16 per share cash out. But we're not sure whether Sherry Redstone really is kind of manipulating this in any way, or whether she's kind of the voice behind this, or whether she simply wants to see Bronfman kind of have this bid just to make sure that there aren't that she's reducing her litigation risk. So again, it's a little bit unclear, but definitely I think Bronfman coming in, sweetening his bid, does set the stage in a way for a bidding war. So it's going to be interesting to see whether Skydance comes in and sweetens their proposal.
You've also talked about how a lot of questions still remain when it comes to some of the risks, including its valuation. So Class B shares of Paramount down about 24% year to date. Unpack sort of the valuation type issues that it's facing when it comes to a potential bidding war like this.
Yeah, so the valuation has always been a sticking point. And the major shareholder outcry against the Skydance proposal was that it was in fact only benefiting maybe two people, right? One was Sherry Redstone and the other is, of course, the Ellisons and the Skydance team itself. Now, what Bronfman is arguing is that in his proposal, he's matching quite a bit of what Skydance has offered. The one thing that he's not doing is diluting existing shareholders. And the way that Skydance is diluting existing shareholders is by forcing Paramount to actually buy the Skydance studio at a fairly high multiple. We think that the multiple is about 14 to 15 times EBITDA. Meanwhile, you have the rest of the media landscape trading at about 6 times, and Paramount itself close to only about 7 or 8 times. So obviously a very rich multiple there for Skydance, again, diluting the shareholders, and Bronfman is saying his deal does not do that. When it comes to valuation, I mean, the reason that we're seeing, all of the media stocks challenged the way that they are is because of their heavy exposure to linear TV, which is in secular decline. And the writing is obviously on the wall because we saw both Paramount and Warner Brothers in their most recent quarter actually take huge programming write-downs. And so, as that exposure to linear TV remains high, this valuation is going to be a constant question mark. One could argue, though, that Paramount still has significant exposure to a very good film and TV production studio and should therefore trade definitely higher than at that $15 that Skydance was offering.
Geetha, once again, great stuff. Geetha Ranganathan, U.S. media analyst from Bloomberg Intelligence from Princeton. Jess, I hired a lot of really, really, really good people at Bloomberg Intelligence.
You did.
None better than Geetha Ranganathan. She has
fabulous.
become one of the top media analysts on Wall Street in a relatively short period of time. So it's great stuff. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Disney looking for some help finding a new CEO. It's named James Gorman, former chief executive officer at Morgan Stanley, to lead that search for a successor to Bob Iger. And Gorman joined Disney's board this year and also oversaw succession at Morgan Stanley. We have Disney shares. They are little changed. Apple may be looking for a new executive too. Sources say the head of its App Store, Matt Fisher, who runs the business since 2010, well, he's leaving in October. The company's been under regulatory pressure on its App Store. We have Apple shares up about 0.2%. The Paramount merger takes another twist. Sources say media investor Edgar Bronfman Jr. raised his bid to $6 billion. We get more from Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta.
We already know that Paramount had accepted an offer from Skydance, the company, of course, led by David Ellison, but they had, again, until Wednesday at midnight to solicit other offers, and they got that offer, so we'll see where they go next.
Now, Paramount up more than 1%. To earnings we go, where turnaround efforts at Peloton really moving the markets. The fitness company reported revenue profit beat analyst estimates in the fourth quarter. Right now, shares up 27%. And BJ's Wholesale Club, they reported comparable club sales for the second quarter. Topped estimates, that excludes gasoline sales. But here's the thing, second quarter revenue fell short of expectations, so their shares down about 7%. Shares of Zoom Video Communications up 11%, reported second quarter results, topped expectations, raised its full year forecast. It also announced that its CFO would resign. And the pressure continuing to build for Snowflake, its shares down 13% after delivering disappointing sales forecasts, announcing its CEO was stepping down. And pilotless flying cars could soon be a thing. The world's first commercial air taxi service plans to launch this year, with China's eHang among the companies competing in that market. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, a quick check of this market. The S&P 500 down about 3 points, no real movement there. The Dow's off about 50. The Nasdaq's off about 30 points. That's about 0.2%. The volume is light here today. 10-year Treasury, that is up about 5 basis points. We're at 3.85% there. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul, Jess, and Lisa. Tonight, Vice President Kamala Harris will wrap up the 4-day Democratic National Convention. Last night, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz made a direct appeal to swing voters in Middle America as he accepted the vice presidential nomination.
If you're a middle-class family or a family trying to get into the middle class, Kamala Harris is going to cut your taxes. If you're getting squeezed by prescription drug prices, Kamala Harris is going to take on Big Pharma.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison has more.
His speech was aggressively Midwestern, and as a Midwesterner myself, I recognized a lot of the themes that he was hitting in there. This was very much an Americana, down-home type speech. He was really leaning into his small-town roots. He grew up in Nebraska, lived much of his life in Minnesota, and he's really talking about his experience as a teacher, as a football coach.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison, part of our team covering the DNC in Chicago. Now, after the speech, Senator J.D. Vance was asked by CBS about Michelle Obama's Tuesday night address, accusing Donald Trump of being threatened by two successful people who happen to be black.
I admire Michelle Obama as a person, but I think that rhetoric's just totally uncalled for. Donald Trump has actually been a great ally of Americans, rich or poor, black or white. He caused rising wages for the American middle class, and he's actually had a lot of success in the black community in this country. I don't think Donald Trump is threatened by anybody because of their skin color. I think that he's really worried about the future of this country and what's happened under Kamala Harris's leadership.
Vance also says it's bizarre for Tim Walz to say that Donald Trump wants to deliver rising prices for the middle class. Italian search and rescue teams have retrieved a fifth body from a sunken yacht off Sicily, where British tech tycoon Mike Lynch and Morgan Stanley International Chair Jonathan Bloomer are among those feared to have died. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. More with Paul, Jess, and now Charlie.
All right, very good. Michael Barr, we appreciate it. Jess, you've got a story there about a huge diamond.
The second biggest diamond ever is found in a mine in Botswana. So when you're looking at this stone, it's yet to be thoroughly assessed, so it's unclear whether it'll yield the highest quality gems here. But basically, it's a massive 2,492 carat diamond. So, like I said,
it's like the size of a softball or something.
I know, it is massive. Like if our listeners go into the terminal to read this story, I mean, just the picture of it and the first visual image, I mean, it's massive. So it's an uncut gem found at a project run by one of Canada's Lucara here. But seeing some of this, though, it's pretty massive. So the miner actually previously recovered this, but it was not necessarily in a gem quality type stone here. So even if the diamond does not turn out to be gem quality, still recovering such a big stone will still be a major boost here when you are looking at this company here.
I mean, so Lucara's Caro mine is famous for giant stones. In 2015, Lucara found the 1,109 carat Lascetti La Rona, which at the time was the second largest ever and eventually sold for $53 million. The mine has also yielded an 813 carat stone that fetched a record $63 million. Those two gems were both type 2A, the most prized stone. So we don't know what type this new one is.
So if people want context here for what the biggest diamond ever was, it was actually discovered in South Africa in 1905. 1905, so quite over a century ago, obviously. But it was cut into several polished gems at the time. So the two largest ones, though, of course, were the Great Star of Africa and then the Lesser Star of Africa. So those are set in the crown jewels of Britain.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Cool. It's a good story. All right. I mean, this thing, I don't know how many like rings, diamond rings you can make out of this stone, but again, these things are selling for $50-60 million on the open market. So keep an eye on that. Great story on the Bloomberg terminal. You can check it out at Bloomberg.com as well. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to get some of the stock stories moving these markets with Norma Linda. She covers all the equity markets for Bloomberg News. She'll join us in just moments. Lee Klaskow, he is our transportation analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. I need to figure out what's going on up there in Canada. They're on strike up there, and I think that's going to have a major impact on just North American logistics, maybe global movement of goods. So we'll figure out what's going on there. Then supposedly, we're going to hear from Tom Keene. He's out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Bow tie and all in, the high country of, out there in the Grand Tetons. We'll see if he can make it for 11-12 discussion. But we're going to start it all off. Mr. Charlie Pellegate at Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red right now, right to the numbers, because the S&P, after earlier gains, now down 1 point. Little changed at 56.19, a drop of less than 0.1%. The Dow down 53, down 0.1%. We've got NASDAQ down 17, a drop there of 0.1%. 10-year at 3.85%, with the 2-year 3.99%. Gold down $30 the ounce to $24.82, falling below 2,500, down 1.2%. WTI up 1.6%, 73.06 for a barrel of WTI. Bond yields climbed. Stocks struggled for direction. Traders gearing up for Jay Powell's speech tomorrow. Amid bets, he will signal willingness to cut rates, albeit at a moderate pace. But what about the broader economic backdrop? Russ Kosterich is portfolio manager at BlackRock Investment Management, and he was a guest this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
I think the reality is, yes, the economy is slowing. We had some evidence of that yesterday. We had a revision to the non-farm payroll numbers, but the economy is not collapsing. We still have decent retail sales, and I think that movement in the VIX a few weeks ago was just way overdone.
Russ Kosterich of BlackRock. You can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. After earnings, Urban Outfitters down 9%. Our Nora Melinda will have a lot more on Urban Outfitters in just a moment. After earnings, Zoom Video Communications up 12.3%. After earnings, Snowflake down now by 12.9%. Recapping, S&P just turning positive, back in the green right now, a little changed, up by 1 point. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pelleton, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jess Menton sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast. And if you're listening to us in Boston, our new home starting September 3rd will be 92.9 FM. That's the day after Labor Day. Bloomberg Radio moving to 92.9 FM in Boston. Norma Linda joins us here from Bloomberg News. Nora, what do you look at in terms of the stock market movement this morning?
Well, let's take a look at Advance Auto Parts. That's ticker AAP. These shares are lower for their worst day in over a year. They're tumbling as much as 22%. And this is after its outlook cut was worse than investors were looking for. D.A. Davison actually calls the sale price potentially lower than some expected. And that's in reference to Carlyle Group, which said that it's selling its Worldpac unit, or the company Advance Auto Park is selling its Worldpac unit to Carlyle Group for $1.5 billion here. So that's something that investors are really watching as we're thinking about that space. Have you guys ever been to Advance Auto Parts?
I have. It's been a while, though.
Okay.
But when I had a car in Texas, I did go.
Okay.
I no longer have one, though.
I always think about when my dad used to drag me there, and I'm sitting there crossing my arms like, can we get out of here?
You were over it. Something else you're looking at too, of course, another retail space here, BJ's Wholesale Club. So this stock down about 7%, on pace for its worst day since May of 2022. What's going on?
So here it's actually in reference to its pricing efforts. So as we know, Costco actually raised its fee for the first time since 2017, but it seems that BJ's isn't doing the same. And as we think about these companies, they're very membership based, and a lot of investors are really looking for that pricing power here, and it doesn't seem to be getting that. It actually lowered its annual merchandise margin forecast and said its year-adjusted EPS may come in at the lower end of its previously issued range. That's not at all what a trader would want to hear.
Right. And BJ is the ticker symbol on that, so it's down about 7.3%. So worst day in a couple years here. And then what else are you keeping a close eye on?
Well, I wanted to look at retail really quickly. Urban Outfitters, and that's ticker URBN. Those shares are down the most since February, down as much as 15%. And this is after lackluster sales have spurred a cut for the company. Its sales growth missed expectations, and analysts are noting that its sales deceleration in July and into August, as well as additional markdowns, are going to put some pressure on margins. I've never shopped at Urban Outfitters. I always found it to be pretty expensive, but I do think that's where the cool kids shop.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a throwback for me. I mean, I haven't been there maybe 20 years
in the eons, right?
It's been a while.
But I'm also looking at real estate. I actually worked on a story recently. I mean, when am I not?
That's her main jam on our equities team.
Yeah. Worked on a story with a colleague, Natalia. We worked on this taking stock story, and it's really looking at the fact that traders, hedge funds in particular, went from really neglecting real estate stocks to now piling into them. So we're seeing the real estate sector more broadly in the S&P 500 gaining about 18% from its April low. So that's pretty substantial. And we did see hedge funds buying real estate stocks at the fastest pace in 4 months through the week of August 16th. So it does seem like they're betting on this beaten down sector here.
Yeah, you know, so latest thing crossing the terminal here, another Fed speaker. So Fed Bank of Boston President Susan Collins saying it'll be soon appropriate to begin cutting interest rates to help preserve a still healthy labor market. So continuing to have these Fed speakers come in ahead of Powell tomorrow.
I think so. All right, Norma Linda, thank you so much for that report. Norma Linda covers all the equities for Bloomberg News. All right, here's the story. You can take the boy out of Wall Street, but you can't take the Wall Street out of the boy. Tom Keene is at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, exactly where he should be. But unlike Michael McKee was sporting a cowboy hat and a nice casual Western wear, Tom bringing the Wall Street attire out there, the gray suit, the bow tie. I see the bow.
Was that a green bow tie? I like
it's
that.
Solid.
Yeah.
Tom, how's everything out in Jackson Hole? You're relaxing?
It's really good. Let me give you a little vignette of what's going on. It's an absolutely spectacular morning here in Jackson Hole. We think we're blessed with wonderful weather through the day. Right beside us, Mike McKee will tell us when. The important worthies, Chairman Powell, Governor Bailey, Michael McKee, they'll walk out here. But right now, moments ago, Chairman Powell and Mrs. Powell walked by as they relaxed for a moment before this speech. I would suggest here at Jackson Hole that speech was amended after what we saw yesterday with the employment revisions. There'll be a little more discussion, a sentence or more here, a sentence or more there, about the real economy versus the Fed parlor game of what interest rates are going to do.
I'm glad you brought that up, Tom, because Fed Chair Powell, after their June decision during the Q&A, he had brought up that he was aware that some of the jobs numbers were a bit overstated, but it is interesting there. But of course, just a reminder, Paul, last year, I believe, whenever Tom was at Jackson Hole, I do remember you did a segment with our Odd Lots crew when it comes to Joe Weisenthal and Tracy Alloway, where you were at the Pioneer Grill. I think you ordered a gin to basically measure where inflation was. So should we expect to see y'all do another segment like that?
What is it? It's just Benton Spies here at Jackson Hole. It just came out of the Pioneer Grill. Bramo and I have it. Halima Croft was with us from RBC Capital Markets, just iconic on petroleum and that. Bramo was talking serious questions. They ate healthy. Wyoming cut oatmeal. I had bacon, eggs, sausage, full English. It's called a full Wyoming out here. But what's interesting about it is the Pioneer Grill, iconic here from 1955, is based on tourism, and that's part of our consumption. The people out here saying it's been a pretty good summer of tourism, and that's what we hear, this word solid. The backdrop for the Powell speech tomorrow is a solid economy, solid GDP, solid employment. Granted, it's breaking a little bit. But we're in a lot better place now than the doom and gloom crew thought 3 Jackson holes ago.
Right, and Tom, that goes to kind of, I guess, the current view here, Tom. Out there in Jackson Hole, we got all the esteemed economists out there. Is there a feeling that the Federal Reserve has done its job in negotiating I guess, a soft landing?
Well, that's up to debate. I don't put much credence in that, Paul. There's a lot of look back. The analog is back to 1994 and 1995. I have trouble with that as well. I think what we've got is a post-pandemic economy. There's been a lot of fiscal stimulus. We're all aware of that. That's an election topic, no question about it, to November 5th. But what I would say is in the post-pandemic reach, we've seen in America where something's going on. Mike McKee's much better at this than I am, and I think he'd tell you we're not going to know where productivity is, the dynamics, the technology dynamics of America out 5 years or 10 years. We're making it up as we go, and Chairman Powell speaking tomorrow, he's making it up as he goes.
All right, Tom, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're busy out there in Jackson Hole. Tom Keene, he is, of course, the host of Bloomberg Surveillance. He is out there with Lisa Abramowitz, with Michael McKee. They're going to be broadcasting live there tomorrow from Jackson Hole, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m.
Tune in.
Wall Street time in getting prepared for Fed Chairman Powell's speech. So Tom is out there anchoring that coverage. We appreciate getting a few minutes of his time. Let's go up to Canada here. The railroaders, they're striking. I think that's a big deal, but let me ask somebody who knows about this stuff. Lee Klaskow, he's a senior transportation analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. Lee, is this Canadian National, Canadian Pacific? They're striking it. Do we have that right? And what does it mean?
Well, they've locked out their employees because the union threatened to strike. Okay. So for railroads, you have to kind of shut down operations safely to make sure that, not only your employees can get home, but also, the equipment is safely stored. So that's kind of what we've seen happen. That's obviously going to impact volumes of the Canadian rails, both Canadian Pacific and Canadian National. They make up around 25% of originated carloads in North America. And, the impact will be felt across the supply chain because it's not just a Canadian thing. It's also going to impact the rails that they interchange with. And also both Canadian Pacific and Canadian National also go into the United States. CP also goes directly into Mexico. About a third of Canadian National's volumes or revenues, I should say, are tied to cross-border traffic. So, it's not just going to be impacting Canada. How we see it playing out is that these kind of work stoppages don't last that long typically. Usually they're usually forced into some sort of arbitration. When it starts really impacting the economy, the Canadian government kind of took a hands-off approach going into Thursday when the deadline was there. They might take more of a kind of a direct approach now that freight is stopping to flow. And for the railroads, the two railroads impacted, it's going to impact their earnings. A lot of the freight is going to be just delayed. It's not necessarily going to be lost, but some of their, more truck competitive freight, like intermodal, that's a little more time sensitive, could get lost to other modes, namely trucks.
You've also talked about how, due to the different labor disruptions, shippers have been diverting freight from those Canadian ports toward the U.S. West Coast. So what I'm wondering is who kind of wins and who loses from this? Because you've also talked about how this sort of situation has helped boost Union Pacific and other sort of intermodal traffic in recent weeks.
Yeah, so how we see this playing out is who's going to benefit. Well, if it's freight that's headed into Canada that's going to end up in the United States, it's not going to go into Canada because the steamships are going to avoid those ports due to the work stoppage. So they might try to bring that freight into Southern California or the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. But that being said, the Gulf Coast and East Coast are also facing, those ports are also facing their own labor issues. They have a contract that comes up in September 30th with their unions. And right now, there doesn't seem like there's an agreement, at least in the near term. So, a lot of shippers have been redirecting their freight to Southern California. So then who wins? Well, big winners would be Union Pacific and Burlington Northern. And also in Burlington Northern, that's a wholly owned subsidiary by Berkshire Hathaway. And so also some of the intermodal players might benefit too, because you'll have maybe longer lengths of haul, which should drive higher revenues for the players. And also, we expect to see a little bump in truck spot load rates next week. As maybe more and more capacity might be needed to move that time-sensitive freight that's being impacted by the Canadian labor strife.
Lee, I wonder is this time of year particularly crucial? I'm thinking about the retailers maybe stocking up their shelves, getting ready for the holiday season. Was this time period chosen, or is this just happenstance?
This is happenstance. This
Okay.
is just like when their contract came up, and not all labor issues have been terrible this year. CSX yesterday announced that they reached an agreement 4 or 5 months ahead of their deadline with about 25% of their unionized workforce, which included a 3.5% pay increase on an annual basis over the next 5 years. So it's not all bad news for labor, but it's not all bad news when it relates to labor, I should say. But we hope that things in Canada come to a close and the rails get back to work, not only for the economies involved, but the people involved as well.
What does this mean for commodities traffic growth from here? Because it's largely dependent on the pace of course, China's economic recovery, and since it's also a major importer of North American materials as well.
Yeah, so as China goes, so does commodity demand globally. In addition to covering railroads, we cover marine shipping, the dry bulk and tanker market as well. They're a major player and importer of goods. Their economy has not been as good as many were expecting, and that is definitely going to have an impact on demand. With rails, what we should see on the commodity side is a lot of lumpiness in the weekly volume data that we get from the Trade Association, the American Rail Association. And so, while a lot of that freight is not going to get lost like to other modes, like maybe more truck competitive stuff, it's just going to get delayed. So it's going to create probably more lumpy earnings for Canadian National, Canadian Pacific in the third and fourth quarter. Probably it's going to weigh on the third quarter and maybe be somewhat of a tailwind in the fourth quarter.
All right, Lee, thanks so much for joining us. Always appreciate getting your views there. Lee Klaskow, Senior Transport, Logistics, and Shipping Analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence, joining us via Zoom from Princeton, New Jersey on that. Canadian Railways, they lock out their workers as talks fail, snarling trade there. So that brings up the risk of a possible strike here. So Lee is our global leader of all that trucking and railroads and logistics and all that kind of stuff. So he is our go-to guy there. Coming up, Ben Miller, CEO of Fundrise, on the state of the commercial real estate business. This is a topic that continues to fascinate me because, I just wonder if how much worse it will get, and when will we feel it in the markets? Will it just be kind of a slow rollout of, banks having problems, certain properties failing on the mortgages?
Yeah, no, it's a key thing, and especially when we're talking about more of those commercial segments. But then there's other pockets that have been still holding up pretty well, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you own warehouses,
that's right.
That's been a great thing. I mean, because we're shipping everything to our front doorstep. You got to need the warehouses. S&P 500 off 6 points here. Not much happening in the equity markets. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are in the red. We have got the S&P now down by 18 points at 5602, a drop of 0.3%. Traders gearing up for Jay Powell's speech tomorrow. Amid bets, he'll signal willingness to cut rates, albeit at a moderate pace. The Dow is down 173, down 0.4%. NASDAQ down 80, a decline right now of 0.5%. 10-year at 3.86% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.00%. Gold down $33 the ounce, down 1.3%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil right around $73 a barrel, 73.04, up now by 1.5%. Jack Daniel's whiskey maker Brown-Forman has become the latest company to scrap corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs as pressure increasingly grows from conservatives. Their other alcohol brands include Finlandia and Korbel. The company sent a letter to employees informing them that Brown-Forman was going to stop linking executive compensation to progress on DEI. Brown-Forman shares down now by 0.9%. Again, recapping stocks lower. S&P down 17, down 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jess Menton sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, and we're also streaming live on YouTube as well. Well, presumably, we're going to hear from Fed Chairman Jay Powell tomorrow, and he'll presumably confirm what the market believes, which that interest rates are soon to begin falling. That should be good for a number of asset classes, including real estate, both commercial and residential. So let's get an update there. Ben Miller is the CEO of Fundrise. Fundrise is the largest direct-to-consumer alternative asset manager in the U.S. Hey, Ben, again, it looks like interest rates are going to begin falling. How does that inform your view of real estate?
Yeah, for the first time in a while, real estate has a bull market tailwind. Basically, real estate is highly interest rate sensitive, and with the rise from interest rates going from 0 to 5%, 5.5%, that really hurt real estate prices, especially institutional real estate prices that price off yield. Now we're talking about rates falling by potentially 50%, from 5.5% to 3%, and that could have a huge impact on real estate prices.
And when you're talking specifically about those real estate prices, obviously there's commercial and then residential real estate, but you've talked about how apartments are likely to see a rally, but not necessarily as clear when it comes to single family housing. Kind of unpack that for us.
Yeah, well, so single family housing is priced by supply and demand. And so what surprised, I think, a lot of bears in the last couple of years is that high interest rates didn't lower single-family housing prices. Actually, housing prices stayed healthy. And that's because most people have long-term fixed-rate mortgages. The average mortgage is below 5%. I think 75% of people have a mortgage below 5%. And so the reality is that high interest rates really didn't impact the housing market like people expected. And home sellers didn't want to bring their house to market when interest rates were so high. So what ended up happening is supply of housing from existing homeowners was absolutely depressed. It's the lowest almost in history. And that low supply of housing kept prices up because prices are determined by where supply meets demand. So now, as interest rates start to fall, on one hand, that's good. It'll make housing more affordable. On the other hand, it may bring more houses to market.
That's kind of...
If more houses come to market, that could actually cause prices to actually stay dampened despite falling interest rates.
Right, and that's kind of where I wanted to go, Ben. I'm looking at the Mortgage Bankers Association 30-year fixed. It peaked kind of back in late 23 at about 7.8, 7.9%. We're now down to 6.5. Where do you think mortgage rates need to go? Is there like a clearing level, you think, where the marginal seller would come back into the market and would get some more activity in the real estate, residential real estate?
My view is that mortgages will end up in the mid fives as the most likely. But unfortunately, if you look at the last decade, the average mortgages were in the threes. And so for a house to get as affordable as it was in the 2010s, you really need not just rates to fall, but you need wages to increase. And that's going to take a long time. And so affordability is going to remain a challenge, I think, through the rest of this decade as we make progress on wages and bring rates down, but not to where they were last decade.
And when it comes to obviously higher rates and how that has slowed new construction, especially when it comes to apartments, what do you think that could mean for when you have the direction and the path for cuts potentially coming soon here, but not necessarily what it seems like, not at an aggressive pace, but even if it is more gradual, do you think that could ease some of the slowing that we did see with new construction for apartments?
Right. So just to recap, what happened was the low rates in 2021, 2020 caused a spike in new construction, especially in apartments. It's an all-time high. And that new supply started in 2021 and is delivering now. And so right now we're at all-time high. But if you look at starts or new construction, we finance and build a lot of housing. We probably are financing new construction in the thousands of units. And you're seeing that it's very difficult to start a new apartment project. A lender is very reluctant to lend. They're lending at low proceeds, so maybe 55% of the cost of the project, and at maybe a 7% interest rate, maybe even higher. So it's very hard to make it pencil, and so new construction is falling off a cliff. And as a result, by late next year, there'll be some of the lowest new supply in probably modern history. So we're going to go from an oversupplied to undersupplied market. And as a result, I think that we'll see rents continue to grow, rent prices continue to grow because of the falling supply of new apartments.
Hey, Ben, let's switch gears a little bit. On the commercial side, I think the most concern for most investors is on the office market. Where are we in terms of kind of flushing out and trying to find a bottom there? I don't see a lot of transactions that would help me to get a sense that maybe this market's bottoming.
No. I mean, there's a real fundamental change. I mean, the market has lost somewhere between 30 to 50% demand for office as a result of work from home. So from pre-pandemic to now, office occupancy is probably going to fall 30 to 50%. That will have a consequence to office rents and office prices. And that process is going to take at least a half a decade, another 5 years, I think, of decline, repricing, sort of compounding or vicious cycle dynamics. And so that is, I think, not only is it obviously bad for the $3 trillion of office, which probably will lose at least $1 trillion of value, maybe $1.5 trillion of value, but also for downtowns across the country, downtown DC, downtown San Francisco. I think the city budgets and the state of those streetscapes are going to see a lot of challenges that I think no one has good solutions in the midterm. I mean, probably going to take half a decade to really find the bottom and really figure out how to rebuild those downtowns.
One question I have is when it comes to work from home. I know Paul's very passionate about this. We actually have a work shift column here at Bloomberg. And so there was an article earlier this summer where they talked about empty offices risk wiping out about $250 billion in commercial property values. So that U.S. office vacancy rate is forecast to hit a peak of 24% by 2026. If you looked at where it was sitting, basically in the first quarter of this year, it was around 19.8%, Paul. So I kind of wanted to pick your brain when it comes to what you're looking at this bin and that kind of dynamic from the work from home sort of aspect in your sort of purview in what you do.
Yeah, so Fundrise is a technology company and also an investment company. And so we understand a lot about both how technology affects the markets, and also we have 2 million users, 2 million customers, and so we have a really good sense of how people behave across the United States. And so the reality is that work from home is not only permanent, but I think we're still actually at the beginning of a cycle of technology affecting office. I mean, we saw this happen with e-commerce. 1999, e-commerce was only 1% of all commerce. Now it's 16% of all commerce. Work from home today is, approximately 25%. And I think it'll grow because we'll see more technological progress. AI will have huge impacts on the efficacy of working from home, virtual reality, driverless cars. And so I think that the extrapolations into the future are underestimating the impact of technology.
Yep, that's going to be a long-term trend. And again, for the commercial real estate, particularly the office, a profound one. Ben Miller, he is a CEO of Fundrise. We appreciate getting a few minutes of his time. The market's rolling over a little bit with the S&P off about 0.3%. The Nasdaq's off about 0.5% here. We have the Dow off 148 points. It's 0.3%. Yields coming up a little bit higher here. 10-year Treasury 3.85%. WTI crude oil on the commodity side up almost 2%. So rallying here. Right now, with our world and national news in New York, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you, Paul. Jess, Charlie. Democratic vice presidential nominee Tim Walz used his speech at the Democratic National Convention to appeal to swing state voters. Walz also had a pointed attack at former President Trump's agenda.
Is it weird? Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's also wrong. And it's dangerous.
Surprise, Oprah Winfrey took the stage last night at the DNC to throw her support behind Vice President Kamala Harris.
We're all Americans, and together, let's all choose Kamala Harris.
Tonight, Harris is set to accept her party's nomination for president. Bloomberg's Amy Morris has a preview.
San Francisco Mayor London Breed had some words of advice for Vice President Harris.
When she is herself and giving it her all and speaking from the heart, there is nothing like it. She is strong, she is firm, she is committed to doing this work, but also she's a very compassionate person who deeply cares about justice and taking care of people, and she's proven that time and time again with the work that she's done over the years.
Breed says Harris is known for her prosecutorial skills, and while she is tough on crime, she also holds compassion for small-time first offenders. Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
The Republican vice presidential pick, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, had a chance to listen to Tim Walz deliver his speech.
One of the interesting things about Tim Walz's speech is he talked a lot about what Kamala Harris would do, what Kamala Harris planned to do. Well, Kamala Harris has been the vice president for 3.5 years, and she hasn't done any of it. In fact, what she has done has caused a lot of suffering and a lot of problems for the American people.
Senator J.D. Vance spoke to ABC. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines,
That's
and
this week's
breaking
edition
news
of Bloomberg.
24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ in the red right now. We are trading at just about the worst level of the day on the S&P, down 24 at 55.96, below 5,600 now on the S&P, a drop of 0.4%. The Dow down 129, down 0.3%. NASDAQ down 147. The composite index down 0.8%. 10-year yield 3.85%. With a 2-year 3.99%. Gold down 1.4%, $24.78 the barrel. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 1.8%, $73.24 on WTI. The weekly report on jobless claims is in, and it is somewhat reassuring. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Initial jobless claims barely increased last week, suggesting America's labor market is moderating only gradually. Claims rose by just 4,000 at 232,000. In another reassuring development, the 4-week average dropped at lowest in a month. Nonetheless, monthly data show the U.S. unemployment rate rose to an almost 3-year high in July, 4.3%. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Shares of BP are at the lowest in close to 2 years as investors punish the company for shifting away from the oil and gas business. BP down now by 0.1%. Other oil companies trading higher today. ExxonMobil up 0.7%. Chevron up by 0.5%. Again, recapping stocks lower. S&P down 22, a drop of 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pello, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Jess Menton, she's sitting in for Alex Steele, and we are live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube as well. Big speech for Kamala Harris tonight to wrap up the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The question is, how much policy will be in this speech? Let's check in with Nathan Dean. Nathan Dean, he's a senior policy analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's down in Washington, D.C., for better or for worse. Nathan, big speech for Kamala Harris today. What are you expecting to hear from VP Harris?
So I think it's going to be somewhat light on details. I mean, this isn't one of those campaigns where we're getting really deep into the policies at the moment, but I do think that Vice President Harris is going to reflect on policies that sort of impact or the middle to low income consumer. Go back to her speech from last Friday, her economic speech. She talked about price gouging. She talked about housing. Expect both of those to come back in. The ability of an American to buy a first-time home, for example. We're going to see probably some statements on that. But overall, this speech is a vision speech. I mean, this isn't going to get into the weeds of certain tax credits or anything like that. That's going to be later on the campaign trail. But I think tonight is really her case to the American people, why she should be president and how different of a contrast her vision of American is versus what President Trump has said during his speech at the RNC convention a few weeks ago.
To your point, Nathan, you were mentioning what we heard from Kamala Harris last week at a rally, and she had basically talked about her plans, as you know, for this opportunity economy for the middle class, but did point out that it was going to roll out those policy ideas in the weeks ahead. So to your point, when you're thinking about that, we probably won't get as specifics here. Once we do hear more about and what they want to include in sort of these policies, how much of this is really when you're thinking about more specificity versus a broader approach? Because there have been times she's been on the trail where sometimes, especially how that works in politics, if you're too specific, sometimes people can come back at you if you don't deliver on some of those policy type goals. So when you're thinking about the specificity versus how broad approach here and the coming weeks when they roll this out, how do you think that administration could potentially sort of roll this out?
Yeah, so I don't think you're going to get the specifics like you would on a quote-unquote normal campaign. Look, she's only had a few months between the time that she declared and time that you get to the election. And, I would always this is the number one thing we always tell our clients to do is that no matter what statement she says on the campaign trail, and the same goes for President Trump, you got to go back to the musical Hamilton when Aaron Burr says, how are you going to get your debt plan through? And Hamilton says, well, I'm going to listen to you, aka negotiate. Pretty much every statement that the president says on a campaign trail or vice president is going to have to be negotiated because the odds of Kamala Harris having the opportunity to unilaterally implement on a lot of what she said. This $20,000, $25,000 tax credit for new home buyers is a perfect example. She's most likely going to have to negotiate with Republicans. So, you're going to see these broad, grandiose goals, if you will. She's probably not going to get into the specifics because she doesn't need to for this election cycle. But ultimately, remember, how is she going to get that plan through?
Nathan, how far to the left do you think Kamala Harris will go in kind of her platform and her stump speech versus maybe trying to stay a little bit more centrist?
I think it's going to be more centrist. Our view is that, that she's going to be progressive in certain areas like the consumer sector. She'll probably mention that as Attorney General of California, she went after the big banks and scored a $25 billion settlement with other attorneys generals against the likes of Bank of America and Wells Fargo. But remember, if you go back to last night's speech with Vice President Tim Walz, he even said, I support the Second Amendment. And it was crickets amongst the convention in Chicago. So you are going to see this moderate take, if you will, this reach for moderate voters out there, because, it's just one of those things where I think politically they need to have this grandiose coalition, both the progressive side of the Democratic Party and the Democratic side of the party. And she's going to have to make her case to a lot of independents that she's going to be moderate on certain things like the border, for example. So I do think you're going to see pockets of moderation in there. But again, on the consumer sector, our base case is that she's going to remain progressive and very in line with the Biden administration's policies.
How likely is it that she'll be able to get some of these policy goes through the finish line here? Because you've talked about how, especially tonight, she'll have to stay on a bipartisan sort of message here as far as what she's communicating to Americans.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to pay attention to tonight is tax, because President Trump's tax cuts from 2017 expire for the individuals at the end of 2025. For those of you in New York and New Jersey, the SALT cap deduction expires at the end of 2025. So no matter what happens, next year is going to be a tax reform debate. So if Kamala Harris comes out and says, I want to increase the corporate tax rate to 28%, you have to pay attention to it. Now, if she has both the House, the Senate, and the presidency, she can do a lot of unilateral actions on the tax rate. Tax issues. But because we don't think she's going to be able to do that, the Senate's kind of looking like kind of difficult for the Democrats at the moment. It's going to be negotiated. So if she says that I want to go to a 28% tax increase, more likely than not, you're probably looking at 21 to 22% to keep those individual tax rates cut. And for those of you in New York and New Jersey, I was talking to our tax analyst, Andrew Silverman, about this. We actually think there could be some opportunity to keep that that state and local tax deduction if she were to win.
Interesting. I'll tell Matt Miller that because that is front and center for him. From the policy perspective, from you geeks in Washington, D.C., Nathan, I mean that with the most affection possible because you are the best down there at this policy stuff. What's still a great unknown for President Harris, Vice President Harris? Is there some policy issues that we just don't have a good feel for where she is?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's going to be on the regulatory side because, Washington is an era of flux at the moment. The Supreme Court recently has come out with a couple of major decisions really crimping the power of the regulators, Chevron deference, major questions. Essentially, the regulators can't do what they've been doing for the last 20 years. And so if Kamala Harris wins, one of the biggest questions we have, and this would be antitrust policy, energy policy. What are you seeing over at the EPA, for example? Are they going to continue as is, and are they going to push these rulemakings down only to get caught up in the courts? Or is essentially rulemaking activity in this space is going to effectively stop? That's one of the biggest questions we have, and the most exposed sectors to it are really big tech, antitrust, and energy, because if they pull back on the regulatory side, you're going to have this policy status quo, and maybe those industries, could take a little bit of a breather and say, okay, let's work in this area what we got right now.
All right, folks, that's Nathan Dean. You need to read his research here because he knows what's happening down there in Washington, D.C. He's one of the absolute best, and it's on the Bloomberg terminal. So BI go, and you can find Nathan Dean and all his research. He's got research out there about all the policies out there, all the big issues, and where each of the candidates stand and who's potential winners and losers. So it's great research. Nathan Dean, Senior Policy Analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. Again, he's down there in the swamps of Washington, D.C., but he gets it done. He knows everybody, and that's why we're fortunate to get a few minutes of his time.
Yeah, no, it's always great to have his perspective, especially in times like this. And we still have a few weeks ahead of the presidential debate, too, which I believe is still on September 10th. But that kind of...
Yes, I think you're right.
It's in flux there, but there might be some other dates. But for now, I think they still have that edge there.
Yeah, that's going to be very interesting. That will be must-see TV, I think.
Right.
So, but again, I'm not sure when Kamala Harris is speaking tonight. I'm guessing it's past my bedtime. I can't even get to the end of the Yankee games.
I think it'll be probably past 10 p.m.
Yeah,
my time, maybe even 11.
I'm up at 4, with the big people. S&P 500 off 36 points. The Dow off about 0.5%. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We have got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ very much in the red. Shares of Urban Outfitters down 8.5% right now. This after the owner of the Anthropology and Free People brands posted quarterly sales growth that came in below Wall Street expectations. Comparable sales in its retail segment rose 2%, below analyst estimates of 2.94%. Comparable sales at its core Urban Outfitters brand also came in below expectations. Urban right now trading lower, down by 8.5%. Peloton Interactive reported revenue and profit that beat analyst estimates in the fourth quarter. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Tom Busby.
Charlie, the quarter signals the struggling fitness company's turnaround efforts are starting to bear fruit. New York-based Peloton managed to eke out revenue growth in the 3 months ending June 30th with sales of $644 million. Now, that was up less than 1% from a year earlier, but easily beat the average Wall Street estimate of $630.1 million. The positive quarter shows the headway the company has made in cutting costs and reducing losses, even while the outlook for growth in the current period suggests the road to recovery will not be easy. Charlie?
And that's Tom Busby reporting Peloton stock right now is surging by 27.5%. Williams-Sonoma reported net revenue for the second quarter that missed the average analyst estimate. Williams-Sonoma shares down now by 7.2%. After earnings, Zoom Video Communications up by 12%. After earnings, Snowflake trading lower now by 13%. And among the names scheduled to report after the close of trading today, we will be hearing from Workday and Intuit. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellett, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, taking a look at these markets here. The S&P 500 off about 0.6%. The NASDAQ off 1% here, off 192 points on NASDAQ. So a little bit of a rollover here. Yields pushing a little bit higher, 5 basis points higher for the 10-year Treasury, 3.85%. And I'm going to call out gold here. It's off about 1.25% here, $2,481. So breaking through the 2,500 level as well. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul. Jess, Charlie, Vice President Kamala Harris closes out the Democratic National Convention tonight when she accepts her party's historic presidential nomination. Harris will speak a day after Minnesota Governor Tim Walz accepted the vice presidential nomination. Speaking in Chicago, Walz introduced himself as a teacher, coach, and veteran with bipartisan credentials. Walz also took aim at Republicans.
If these guys get back in the White House, they'll start jacking up the costs on the middle class. They'll repeal the Affordable Care Act. They'll gut Social Security and Medicare. And they will ban abortion across this country with or without Congress.
Republican vice presidential nominee Senator J.D. Vance spoke to CBS after Walz's speech.
In fact, I think it really just is fundamentally incompatible with the record. Look, Kamala Harris has proposed giving Medicare to illegal aliens. That would bankrupt that program and throw an entire generation of America's seniors into poverty.
And there's word that Robert Kennedy Jr., independent candidate for president, plans to pull the plug on his campaign and endorse Donald Trump. A former Las Vegas politician charged with murdering a reporter is expected to continue testifying in his own defense today. Prosecutors say Robert Tellis stabbed Jeff German to death after he wrote critical articles about Tellis and his workplace conduct. Tellis took the stand against the advice of his lawyers and has denied the accusations, claiming he was framed. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited his top general in the northeastern region bordering the area of Russia, where his troops are fighting to expand the territory they've controlled for more than 2 weeks after a surprise attack. Ukraine's military chief says Kyiv's forces took another settlement in Russia's Kursk region and have increased the number of captured Russian soldiers. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. And back to the people I know, Jess, Paul, and Charlie.
Very good. Excellent stuff. Jess Met and Paul Sweeney here. Jess, we were just talking earlier today about real estate market and mortgage rates and when are we going to see some movement in that market. Well, Bloomberg News is out with the story, some data coming out today. U.S. sales of previously owned homes rose in July for the first time in 5 months, suggesting the housing market is poised to stabilize as mortgage rates decline. Contract closings increased 1.3% from a month earlier to 3.95 million annualized rate. That's according to figures released Thursday from the National Association of Realtors. The pace, the weakest for any July since 2010, was in line with the median forecast in a Bloomberg survey. So, maybe if interest rates start coming down, that'll free up some sellers to put their house on the market, get some traffic going.
On the back of this data, Wells Fargo's economics desk put out a note to clients. So they were talking about how the modest uptick was likely owed to a slip in financing costs the prior month. And they also pointed out how the 30-year fixed mortgage rate averaged about 6.9% in June. So that was according to Freddie Mac. So that's down from 7.1% back in May. But looking over, since I cover stocks, Paul, XHB is the ticker symbol for the ETF that tracks the S&P 500 home builders.
Okay.
And the index. If you look at this, though, year to date up about 19%. So obviously you have companies like D.R. Horton and Lennar and others that are housed in this ETF, but they have recovered. Even though there was a pullback back in July, they've bounced back and not too far from an all-time high.
Well, the big issue out there for folks is just home affordability. So you've got high mortgage rates, but the NAR's report also showed that median sales prices in July increased 4.2% from a year earlier to $422,600. That's a record for any July in NAR data. So home affordability continues to be a big issue. All right, coming up next, a balance of power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines. They're live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Illinois. They're going to have the latest reporting again. Kamala Harris, widely anticipated speech tonight. Balance of power, that starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
From the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
It's the honor of my life to accept your nomination for Vice President of the United States. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for your determination. And most of all, thank you for bringing the joy to this fight.
The governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, on his big night, the running mate, of course, holding forth on night 3 here. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. We're live in Chicago on what is now day 4, culminating all of this exercise this week, the speeches, the organizing, everything leading us up to the moment that Kamala Harris will accept her party's nomination in prime time, assuming things, Kaylee, go on schedule.
Well, that might be a big ask considering the way the convention has gone thus far, but it is worth noting this is a very different convention than Democrats thought they would be throwing just 1 month ago. It would have been Kamala Harris that gave the vice presidential acceptance speech last night. Instead, she is accepting the Democratic nomination for president tonight, and in doing so becomes the first ever woman of color to claim that title as Democratic nominee.
Yeah, we're in an historic period of time here in American politics with a whole new reason here, and you're right, just 4 weeks ago, imagine the extent to which this race has changed leading us up to this moment today. There are thousands of delegates here in Chicago at a fever pitch coming off the last couple of nights of speeches, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Tim Walz, and now, of course, the Vice President, Kamala Harris.
Well, and it raises the question of who else is going to speak tonight, because we don't yet know. We have no idea who will introduce Kamala Harris or whether there will be a surprise musical guest after John Legend gave a nice rendition of
You can just say Beyonce out loud.
Well, yeah, that's what everybody's hoping for, whether or not the Queen comes to town.
That's correct.
And the beehive inside the United Center goes wild. Joining us now for more as we look ahead to this evening's festivities, Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy. So, Gregory, I think it is a valid question. We have seen the most elevated people in Democratic politics, frankly, speak already. Last night included former President Bill Clinton, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, Pete Buttigieg, Josh Shapiro. They have all spoken. So who's left that's going to tee up, build the momentum to Harris's big speech?
Yeah, and one of the things in contrast to the Republican convention, which was really Donald Trump's convention, and you got a speaking slot based on your orbit around Donald Trump. Democrats have had former presidents, former nominees, and it's been an embarrassment of riches for them trying to squeeze all of these different speakers in. I haven't seen the formal list for tonight, but I think you can expect some governors, some senators. I'm thinking people like Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, really trying to show off the full breadth of the Democratic Party and also emphasize some of these key Senate races that are going to be so important to Kamala Harris. If she does get elected, she's going to need support from the Senate and the House to pass her agenda.
Run-up show has been a problem. This thing's going way over every night. They're cutting videos, in some cases speeches. Last night was not an exception. It's been very difficult to get the headliner in prime time. And reports say the DNC is not fooling around tonight. Will people on the East Coast see Kamala Harris?
Yeah, one of the problems we had last night is that Bill Clinton spoke, and of course he probably holds the unbreakable record for most minutes spoken. But Joe and I were talking last night about his 1988 speech, where the biggest applause line of the night was when Bill Clinton said, "In conclusion." And so it was sort of a breath of fresh air, though, to hear Tim Walz last night give a 15, 16-minute speech. I saw him again this morning at the Minnesota delegation breakfast. It was maybe a 3 or 4 minute thank you. This guy is going to be, for reporters, easy to watch because we can get in and out pretty quickly. But yeah, it has been a challenge just because everybody wants to have their say. This is everybody, for any politician, this is the most important moment. It's a career-making moment potentially, and they all want to make the most of it. And when you squeeze in all these performances, the pop culture, everything that the DNC is trying to do to make a very slick, produced television event, it's going to run long and it's going to run past prime time.
I was on the floor for Bill Clinton last night, Kaylee, among some other speakers. He went off the prompter at one point for 12 minutes. And we were looking at the prompter, it's not moving, and he's vamping. He's still getting applause lines, but it does remind us that just because things are produced a certain way, the show doesn't always go the way you plan it.
Well, and don't we know that, working in broadcast, television, and radio. But of course, as you just alluded to, it's a big night for anyone who gets to speak on that stage. But it is perhaps the biggest night of all for Kamala Harris, probably the most important one of her entire political career thus far. Yes, she's been vice president for over 3.5 years, but this could still be an introduction to many Americans to who Kamala Harris really is. What is at stake for her this evening?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish I could come here and tell you that I have a whole bunch of reporting about what it is she's going to say. I don't think any of us know. We're waiting to see who is Kamala Harris and what does she sound like when she's not in the immediate shadow of Joe Biden? Because when you're a vice president, the job is to be joined at the hip on policy. And so the question tonight is, how does she differentiate herself from Joe Biden in subtle or not so subtle ways, especially on issues of the economy? She's already seemed to be maybe going a little bit to the left in terms of her taxing and spending policy, but also on Gaza is going to be the real tightrope where we're going to watch how she talks about that. And of course, as you suggest, she's got to reintroduce herself to the American people. Even among the delegates that I've talked to, they don't know as much about her as they feel like they should. And they're going to want to hear her introduce herself to the American people as the former prosecutor, the former attorney general, and Joe Biden's loyal vice president. Because it's only 74 days until the election, and she's a brand new candidate.
That's true. It's been really interesting to watch Democrats leverage celebrity, entertainment, the influencers we talked a lot about, the 200 of them in the hall. Oprah Winfrey was the late ad last night. We thought she might speak, but wasn't on the initial schedule. They're trying to get the element of surprise, get the element of culture involved here in a different way than Republicans seized with Kid Rock and Hulk Hogan.
At one point last night, I had to think to myself, am I watching a political convention or am I watching the Oscars?
Isn't that something?
It was
with an MC and the whole bit.
Yeah, Stephanie Cutter is the Democratic strategist who had to put together a virtual convention 4 years ago because we were in the middle of COVID. It had to be a televised event. They brought her back this year to really continue that. You saw it with the roll call of the states, which is for quirky and fun and different. They've really turn this into a television show. It has been for many decades, but now I feel like it's turned the corner, that this is a full-on overproduced extravaganza.
Well, and to this exact point, someone else who stood out to me last night was Kenan Thompson. They brought a comedian in specifically with a giant prop book of Project 2025 to talk to everyday Americans who could be affected by that. Instead of like painting it as this very dark, scary thing, which we've heard Democrats do a lot of, they tried to make it funny and perhaps more accessible in that way. And I thought that was a really
maybe getting back to the weird
way of doing it. Yeah.
By the way, they had some Zoom problems, couldn't hear people. It happens to the best of us, I think is the point there, Kaylee. Great to have Gregory Cordy with us here, reporting for Bloomberg here on the ground in Chicago. Gregory, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, it was a big night for the Democrats last evening. It wasn't just the celebrities involved here. A lot of folks speaking about the element of joy.
Kamala Harris is the only candidate in this race who has the vision, the experience, the temperament, the will, and yes, the sheer joy.
That kind of politics also just feels better to be part of. There is joy in it, as well as power.
Most of all, thank you for bringing the joy to this fight.
Let us choose joy.
It's joining us now. Our signature panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, at the table. Of course, longtime Republican strategist, and Jeannie Shanzano as well, Democratic strategist, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, Democratic strategist, as I mentioned, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Here we all are. The big day. This is why we're here. I want to start with last night, though, before we start asking you guys what Kamala Harris is going to say later. Oprah Winfrey, the secret weapon for the Democrats in this convention?
Absolutely. Now, why did Rick and I not get an intro like she gave to Kamala Harris, right?
That's for the special tonight.
You know, absolutely one of the great speakers. I mean, this is the thing as we look forward to tonight, Kamala Harris has a huge bar to leap over. You know, Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, Tim Walz, who I thought did an amazing job.
Did he? A short speech.
It was a touchdown, Joe Matthew.
Yeah, okay.
But I thought, yeah, but that was it, right? What did Mark Twain say? I would have written a shorter letter if I had the time. I mean, thank God for Governor Walz, Coach Walz, for keeping it brief. Other people did not. They have a problem with the timing on this convention to a certain extent. But, you know, Oprah, absolutely a huge star of the show. I thought it might have been Bill Clinton. I think she may have outshined him, but he did a great job as well. But yeah, I thought Tim Walz stole the show. And his son, Gus, how sweet was that?
Yeah, very emotional, very proud of Dad. It's
Yeah.
as
Sure
he watched
was.
him from the floor. But you mentioned Oprah. Certainly a lot of moments of Oprah's speech have gone viral, including a little bit of a dig at J.D. Vance over the whole cat lady thing.
We are not so different from our neighbors. When a house is on fire, we don't ask about the homeowner's race or religion. We don't wonder who their partner is or how they voted. No. We just try to do the best we can to save them. And if the place happens to belong to a childless cat lady, well, we try to get that cat out too.
Clearly quite the reception to the words of Oprah Winfrey last night, Rick, but it raises the question of if there's a little element of stealing the show here. Is it good for the ticket if the speech of those who are teeing up the vice presidential nominee might stand out just as much as the speech of the vice presidential candidate himself?
No, I don't think they have any risk of that. I mean, Wednesday nights, you know, a different audience probably than what we're going to see tonight. And voters have short memories. I guess they're not going to compare Oprah to Harris. I don't think that's a big risk. If anything, you want to have as many eyeballs on each night as you can get. And as we heard from Gregory, this is a bunch of really well-known speakers the Democrats have thrown out there. They all exceed the Hulk Hogan factor. I mean, it's a good group. But I would say I think it's been way too subtle, right? Conventions are about putting that red meat out on the table. You know, it's hard to get Americans' attention, and a subtle dig at vice president nominee or vice president candidate Vance about cat ladies that have no name ID. I mean, if you took a poll today and said, what do you think about cat ladies? They'd like, what are you talking about? So like, I think the whole thing was way too subtle. I mean, it's not overselling, it's underselling. I mean, there were very few direct attacks on Donald Trump, direct attacks on J.D. Vance. This is the opportunity to speak to 20 million people. And it was almost like, oh, we're just going to be kind of cool. And, you know, I actually think that on a messaging front, totally fun, great eye candy, you know, hoopla for the crowd. But making progress in this campaign is about leveling your message and directing attacks. And there were very little messaging there that is going to be good for voters, especially swing voters in key states, and very few attacks are going to stick to the president and J.D. Vance.
Bill Clinton tried to get to that at some point. He seemed to be the attack dog last night. It was the we the people versus me, myself, and I. He called Donald Trump a whiner. He even got to Hannibal Lecter with some pretty good laughs for the crowd. But to Rick's point, does Kamala Harris need to name Donald Trump tonight and talk about him directly?
See, I don't think so, and this is where we disagree. You know, the job for the Democrats is to try to win over these moderate voters in these swing states, some of whom are very attracted to Donald Trump and particularly where he stands on these issues. And so I think attacking Donald Trump front on is not the way to go. And I thought, speaking of Bill Clinton, his remark yesterday was brilliant when he said, stop telling us how much he lies and start counting how much he talks about I. Because the reality is voters know that Donald Trump lies. Quite frankly, they think all politicians lie. So that's no big message. What is this argument, it's all about him. And that's what Bill Clinton tried to underscore last night. So I don't think she should take Donald Trump on in the front-on attack. I think she should let voters know that this is a party that is open to them, and particularly on the all-important issue of the economy, which still reigns supreme. So I think they don't have to attack him straight on. There's been enough subtle attacks. And by the way, on the cat lady, did they have to swing to that one woman in the audience and stare at her? I love cats. This was not right.
Yes, a little bit
Could be a dog lady.
Well, this is very true. That definitely got some attention on social media. But to this point, Rick, and I'll let you respond to what Jeannie said, but also isn't it worth pointing out, voters do know Donald Trump. They know him probably better than most anyone else. He was president for 4 years. He has not left the forefront of American thought, frankly, political thought, at least since he left office. So do you really need to go after a man that voters know so well?
Yeah, I think that there's a difference between being well-known and being well-known for something that is going to come up over the next 4 years. I mean, his record on the economy is ahead of where Kamala Harris is. She cannot win this election if we go into Election Day and Donald Trump is more popular on the economy than she is. How much of the economy did we hear about? This is Bloomberg. We actually think that those things matter. We think Donald Trump's economic plans are inflationary and add enormous amount of money to the national debt. Did you hear any of that at this convention?
So you're
not a peep. You don't
go
have to
after the
attack that.
man.
Yeah,
Go
the
after the
personality
policy.
contest, you're always going to lose against Donald Trump because he's always going to say something more outrageous, more inflammatory than any normal person's going to do. But he has a policy that he has actually articulated, and it's not just a big book called 2025. And they've done a good job at demonizing that. Why don't you crack it open and start talking about some of the things that are in there? I just think that this was an opportunity the last 3 days to lay out what the Democratic attack against Donald Trump's next 4 years are going to be. And it's not about cat ladies, and it's not about, you know, Donald Trump as a person. That's a settled case. Voters have already made their minds up. What they want to know is, how am I going to live better? And if his policies are going to make that worse, you should be talking about it.
We have less than a minute. Can that be fixed tonight when Kamala Harris gets on the stage?
I would be shocked, based on what we saw last week when she articulated her own tax policy, her own economic plan, that they're going to go anywhere near that. So they will have missed this opportunity with millions of Americans looking in for the first time saying, what's this all about?
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature political panel, who will be with us for the duration today on this final day of the Democratic Convention. With more next hour. Thank you both so much. And still ahead on this special edition of Balance of Power, live from Chicago and the DNC, is the first White House National Climate Advisor. Gina McCarthy is going to be with us in just a few moments. So stay here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and we have made it to day 4. This is the big one. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lyons. Kamala Harris speaking in prime time. At least that's the plan tonight, assuming all things stay together. And we expect maybe some surprises along the way as well, having heard from many Democratic luminaries over the course of this week. Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Bill Clinton, they've all had a chance to speak. Nancy Pelosi, and a lot of questions about who might grace the stage tonight.
Indeed, but we do know we will hear from Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, the first woman ever, of course, to hold that title. She will now become tonight officially the first woman of color ever to become and accept the nomination for president from the Democratic Party. And we have a few questions about her speech tonight, Joe. The extent to which she attacks her opponent, Donald Trump, how much of this is a reintroduction to the country, a relisting of her resume, if you will, and also whether or not she's going to get into real specific policy. We've been warned not to expect too much in terms of substance.
Well, remembering the hour-and-a-half-long stem winder we got from Donald Trump on his fourth night of his convention in Milwaukee, there is a thought that maybe keeping this efficient would be helpful and not going too deep into details. There'll be time for that as we move closer to a presidential debate on the 10th of September. But of course, Kayleigh, when it comes to issues like the economy, when it comes to the border, we could hear about that. And, you know, energy policy is going to, of course, be a major theme in this campaign. And I suspect we're going to hear about it tonight.
Yeah, it's already shaping up to be a top issue on the campaign trail, but we haven't received many details yet when it comes to Kamala Harris's plan. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has more on what we do know. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kayleigh, we're still waiting for additional details from the Harris campaign when it comes to their energy agenda. But for the Trump campaign's part, they have been capitalizing on this issue on the campaign trail, urging more domestic drilling in a bid to lower energy pricing. For a sense of the messaging from the former president, take a listen to him on the campaign trail this week as part of his counter-programming to the DNC.
What they've done to inflation, and they caused it with energy. If we were there, our energy, we would be so dominant all over the world right now. We were already energy independent. I made you energy independent, but we would be energy dominant.
Trump has also repeatedly highlighted then candidate Harris's 2019 comments she would support a ban on fracking. The Harris campaign says that's no longer her stance, alleging this is instead part of Trump's, quote, attempt to distract from his own plans to enrich oil and gas executives. We should note U.S. oil output has reached record highs under the Biden administration, but it's becoming a key issue in some energy-producing battleground states like Pennsylvania, which is the second largest producer of U.S. natural gas. It's also where Democratic Congressman Brendan Boyle is from. You two had the chance to catch up with him yesterday on Balance of Power and ask him about Vice President Kamala Harris's reverse when it comes to fracking.
I would expect and certainly hope for an evolution on certain issues. I think it's appropriate. And in the end of the day, I think she arrived at the right place, both in terms of policy and politics.
Harris's campaign is expected to shepherd a more progressive energy agenda, and vice presidential pick Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is considered to be an aggressive advocate when it comes to climate policy. Even so, Joe and Kayleigh, without so many details, climate groups this week actually pledged a $55 million advertising campaign to the Democratic ticket.
Tyler, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall setting us up for an important conversation now with former Environmental Protection Agency Administrator and former White House National Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy. Straight from Dorchester, it's great to see you in Chicago. Thanks for joining us today. We'd like to get specific with you because you can clearly get the sense that people are looking for details, but I want to start more broadly. Are we going to hear about climate and energy policy tonight when she speaks to people, not just in the hall, but those who are at home?
Well, clearly, you're hearing from a ton of climate advocates, and it was already mentioned that it's a $55 million plan that they're putting out to invest in Kamala Harris and Tim Walz because they are climate champions, and they have a proven record that we can rely on. So just how much she wants to get into details on policies and including climate change really is not a concern for all of us who know where she lands on climate and how much effort she's going to take to actually address the climate challenge and accelerate our ability to advance clean energy.
Well, and certainly she's attached to this current administration, which got through the Inflation Reduction Act. She, of course, in her role as vice president, had to be active on the Senate floor for that one. But that has passed and they were able to do so because they did, with her tie-breaking vote, have both chambers of Congress. We don't necessarily know that that will be the case, even if she does win the presidential election, which would leave much more up to regulators, say. Given that the Chevron doctrine has now been reversed, without control of Congress, what really is going to be the power of the presidents and the regulators they appoint to lead agencies like the EPA to do things on their own?
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that Chevron doctrine often applied to EPA requirements and rules and regulations, and EPA is very good at figuring out how to address those challenges and move forward with the kind of protections we need, not just on climate, but air and water, all the kinds of pollution that families care about. But we also have to recognize that Kamala Harris has really been a champion on this issue, and I fully expect and I have seen already from a release that was put out just 2 days ago between Biden and Harris to talk about what's next. So we are not worried that we're going to stand still. And frankly, I'm not worried about the American public really getting behind these climate actions because they save families money. They grow jobs. You see the unions there at the DNC. They're excited about how much is being built again. So we've already seen a great shift. And remarkably, it almost looks like the IRA is bipartisan. Now, hopefully it was, and it will be, but you have Republicans now who recognize that most of the money is going to their districts. And they're signing letters saying we're not going to get rid of the IRA. So there is something very new afoot. And I think it's all about the shift from talking about anybody's personal interest to actually the interests of the people in the United States of America. And that is beginning really to grow.
What do you make of this whole fracking flap? Republicans have seized on this turn by Kamala Harris, having at one time called for a federal ban on fracking and obviously has turned away from that now. You heard what Brendan Boyle said in an awfully important state like Pennsylvania. Are you disappointed that Kamala Harris has turned away from her original stand on this, or is fracking an essential component of our energy infrastructure?
You know, I think this is all being put in the context of trying to figure out how the shift to clean energy and away from oil and gas can become some kind of a platform for the Republican Party. None of this is a fight right now. What we need to talk about is how do we make that shift to clean energy, and how do we keep people's energy at a lower cost. And we can't shut off oil and gas today or tomorrow. We have to make that transition forward. And part of the challenge is that I think the oil and gas sector hasn't actually responded well to the climate crisis. In fact, they're supporting a lot of the Republican sort of platforms that seem to make it a controversy, when in the end, it's very simple. You know, people need to have clean energy because they need cheaper electricity costs. People need to have vehicles that they can move forward in that won't pollute them and kill their kids. There's a whole range of opportunities here. And part of the excitement today is that the DNC has never been more hopeful. You know, I've seen a lot of these conferences, and honestly, we now seem to have an ability with the vice president and with the governor to actually land together to bring unity here in the United States again, to get away from the bipartisan nonsense, to bridge the gaps that we have seen before. And that's what makes us so hopeful and such an opportunity moment. And I just hope we can all grab it.
Well, as we consider what is going to happen next in the United States, who's potentially going to become president here, it is worth noting when it comes to these issues and the pursuit of net zero, different countries are on different timelines, but this is a global issue. And a criticism that frequently comes from Republicans is that the U.S. can't do this alone as long as China and India are still polluting as much as they are. So how much should we be considering not just the policy that these candidates would bring domestically, but how they would interact with adversaries and allies alike in the pursuit of a cleaner environment?
Well, I'm not sure that the Republicans are really that interested in talking about climate change in a way that's really much more reality-based. Look, they've tipped their hand with Project 2025, right? That plan is all about not just minimizing and challenging our democracy itself, but it's all about going back to oil and gas as the winner here, right? It's all about getting rid of the effort of clean energy. And we now know that climate change is such a global problem that we have to bridge gaps between the United States and every country that's out there. And I don't frankly think that any administration has done a better job of trying to make sure that we're investing in the future here. Part of it is engaging the private sector. And private investors are waking up to both the challenge of climate that they know they can see and we can all feel and taste and touch. But it's all about building resilience at home, but it's also about engaging the private sector to invest not just in developed worlds, but in the developing world, in the global south. And the opportunities to do that are enormous. And so I am seeing a shift not just in politics around this, but really in the fundamental way in which our country and others are looking at their economic opportunities moving forward. We don't have to invest in a way that's going to disadvantage our country. We need to invest in a way that provides opportunities to our country, but more broadly, that makes this the global challenge and opportunity of our lifetime. It is every country that needs to engage. But the U.S., frankly, because of curmudgeons on the Republican side in Congress, and I used a nice term, they just have blocked our ability to actually invest in a way that really shows the United States leadership and what we're trying to do. So hopefully that can get corrected as well as we advance some other races in a way that will make this an opportunity for us as well.
You hear from the other campaign, of course, it's not just Republicans in Congress. Donald Trump largely seems to think that your movement is a hoax. He's questioned the role of EVs despite his new relationship with Elon Musk. He says that windmills don't work, they kill birds and cause cancer. Solar doesn't work. When the sun isn't out, you can't watch TV at night. A lot of people take him at his word there. How do you go up against a message like that?
I think you just have to tell the truth. You know, plus the other exciting thing is, first of all, windmills, seriously, windmills. I feel like we're back in Holland from 50 years ago. But the issue is that people are beginning to see both the threat, but they're also of climate change, but they're also seeing that it makes a difference in their lives. We already have 3.4 million homes that have grabbed Inflation Reduction Act monies in order to reduce the costs associated with putting solar in their homes and making their homes more efficient. When people start seeing these benefits, I mean, we are talking about $400 billion in private sector investment. That is thousands and thousands of jobs. And that is real human beings getting a shot at being in the middle class because they have a job again, you know? So it's that excitement that we have to really amplify. We need people to understand that it's not about the planet. It is about the people and them, their families, their communities. And as money gets invested, we are really seeing significant opportunities for individuals to sort of feel it themselves. That's when it's going to take off. And frankly, the outline of new proposals and how much we can do that was just delivered by Biden and Harris really show you the path forward.
All right, Gina McCarthy, great to see you here in Chicago. Of course, former administrator of the EPA. Thank you so much for your time here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Now, we do want to bring you some breaking news that has just crossed the Bloomberg terminal regarding Venezuela. Venezuela's top court has now certified the re-election of President Nicolas Maduro. This is according to broadcast and state TV in Venezuela. Of course, the opposition had rejected his claim of victory. The U.S. itself has raised some concerns about the way in which this election result was brought. But again, Venezuela's Supreme Court has certified President Nicolas Maduro's re-election. So that's the latest in politics elsewhere. But we also want to get the latest on financial markets. And take a look at trading on this Jackson Hole week in addition to Convention Week. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle has a check on the markets for us. Hey, Abigail.
Hey, Kaylee, and it's interesting you should mention that Jackson Hole because earlier today and yesterday, all week really, there's been this feeling of wait and see for what will Fed Chair Jay Powell say tomorrow in that really annual keynote speech, widely expected probably to point to the idea that they will, in fact, be on this trajectory of cutting that the markets have them on. But at one point today, stocks were down sharply. The NASDAQ 100 down more than 1%, a lot of it having to do with chips. So some jitters ahead of course, that big day. Now, if you put all of this together for the S&P 500, right now, really not doing all that much over the last 3 days. This really points to, again, that uncertainty. What will the chairman of the Federal Reserve have to say out in Jackson Hole? But, of course, there is also election 2024. And what's really interesting that's happening this week, as the DNC is happening, the betting odds between VP Harris, Kamala Harris, and the former president, Donald Trump, really narrowing. So when Harris was first elected to the Democratic ticket, or, the presumptive nominee at that point, there was a 30% spread in the favor of Donald Trump. That then quickly shifted in favor of Kamala Harris by 18%. Right now, though, it's really narrowing. There's just 4% between Kamala Harris on top and Donald Trump below. So that means lots of uncertainty right into November. What will their policies mean? What will this mean for the stock market? Typically, presidential election year is very good for stocks. That is the case right now. But again, lots and lots of uncertainty. As for that Harris trade itself, right now we have D.R. Horton. That is that home builder that caters to first-time home builders. With her economic policy, the skeleton of it revealed last week, $1.7 trillion, some of that going to down payments for $2.2% after surging 13% yesterday. And then bringing it back to the Fed, Joe, well, that 10-year yield, it's up 8 basis points, really going in the opposite direction of what traders would be thinking if they think that Fed Chair Jay Powell will be somewhat dovish in terms of the idea of signaling cuts. On the other hand, yields are down so much, that 10-year yield, or 2-year yield, right around 4%, down a good 100 bips from where it had been not so long ago.
Abigail, thanks so much. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle live in New York with her eyes on the markets as we continue our coverage here of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons as we add the voice of Seth Harris, the senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University, former top labor policy advisor to President Joe Biden. He, of course, part of this convention, and it's great to see you, Seth, at the table. Thanks for joining. The role that labor is playing in this campaign has really been fascinating. We've been talking about it since long before Kamala Harris was at the top of the ticket. A lot of people stopped down when they saw Sean O'Brien speaking at the Republican National Convention. And there have been dozens of labor leaders speaking at this event. Should the Teamsters have played a bigger role? Why did the Democrats invite Sean O'Brien?
Well, they invited a couple of dozen Teamster retirees to tell the story of how the Biden-Harris administration basically saved their retirement by ensuring that they would get the pensions that they've been counting on for their entire working lives. To me, that was an immensely powerful moment. I happened to be sharing a hotel with those retirees, and they were so enthusiastic and moved by the experience. I don't think the Teamsters endorsement is going to turn on whether President O'Brien got to speak or didn't get to speak. It's really going to turn on policy and where they think they're going to be able to be most successful going forward. Obviously, I think that the case for Vice President Harris is a very powerful one. I thought Sean O'Brien showed some real guts showing up to the Republican National Convention. You could probably hear a pin drop in the hall when he was talking about rich, powerful corporations and working people.
Well, yeah, and Trump is a scab as well, or I guess that was Sean Fain.
That's right.
Sean
That's
we're
the
talking
other.
about. Sean Fain spoke here with Trump as a scab. That's not exactly what we heard from Sean O'Brien. But when we have this conversation around labor, we are talking a lot in broad ideas of being labor friendly. We know that there were specific policies that Governor Tim Walz, for example, put into place in Minnesota related to labor and unions specifically. Is that something that they're going to be able to do realistically, though, on a national federal scale? How does what someone can accomplish in a state in this second term, he's had Democratic control of the state legislature, translate into something that people across the country can believe they can see?
there's a very close alignment between Governor Walz's agenda in Minnesota and Vice President Harris's and President Biden's agenda at the national level. So President Biden and certainly Vice President Harris have been vigorous advocates for paid family and medical leave. I think there is the opportunity with some members of the Republican Party to make some kind of an effort, not merely on family leave, paid leave, but also on child care, other parts of the care economy, elder care, home health care, because that's a topic that some members of the Republican Party have been talking about. Now, let me just say the Republican nominee for vice president has talked about those issues, but really has proposed nothing.
J.D. Vance wants to expand the child tax credit, for example.
Absolutely, not quite as much as Vice President Harris does, but he does want to expand it. So I think there are some opportunities for advancing the agenda that Governor Walz has been able to advance with a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor. There are other things that I think Republicans in Washington are going to vigorously oppose, and those are the things that support unions, like Governor Walz banned captive audience meetings, those anti-union meetings where workers are locked in a room and harangued for hours and hours and hours. He was able, though, to do something that was done at the national level as well by the Biden-Harris administration, and that is to invest in infrastructure, to invest in changes that will address climate change, and to make sure that those jobs are good union jobs. So there's a very, very close alignment. He certainly ratifies Vice President Harris's agenda nationally, and I think they're completely aligned on what they're going to be able to do for working families.
Kaylee mentioned the T-shirt that we saw, I believe it was on Monday night. Sean Fain, Trump is a scab, big standing ovation. I get it. It's a convention. It's a rally. Some folks wondered if that's the language Democrats should be using when they criticize Donald Trump for such heated rhetoric. But let's just get to it. Is Donald Trump a scab?
Donald Trump crossed a picket line that was set up by the International Alliance of Theater and Stage Employees back when he was just a professional television performer rather than whatever it is that he is now.
Okay. Republican nominee for president.
Exactly. So literally, he is a scab. That's what a scab does, crosses a picket line. Now, when President Fain of the UAW talks about being a scab, he means it much, much more broadly. And what he means is that President Trump cares about himself and billionaires like him. He does not care about working families. So he pretends to go to Michigan during the UAW strike and talk to auto workers. It turns out that the only auto workers in the room were non-union. He went to a non-union facility to do it. He's not advocating for unionized workers or workers more generally. J.D. Vance, very similar, has never supported a piece of real worker empowerment legislation. On the other hand, you have the most pro-union administration in American history. Vice President Harris, very, very central to that labor agenda. And so Sean Fain drawing a very clear, stark distinction, which is his specialty.
I want to talk more about Donald Trump, specifically what he said in North Carolina yesterday in reaction to what we got from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the suggestion that there's a downward revision in the 12 months through March of American job growth by more than 800,000. And this is what the Republican nominee thinks about it.
Before we begin, I want to address the massive scandal around the revised job numbers that were just announced this morning. The new data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that the administration padded the numbers with an extra, listen to this one, 818,000 jobs that don't exist.
A scandal, a padding of the numbers. Seth, how should we actually be thinking about data yesterday, which frankly does suggest there was a little more softness in the U.S. economy than this administration previously thought?
I'm going to defend my colleagues, my former colleagues at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's not a scandal. It is regular business. They have been making these revisions for years and years and years. Out of a universe of 160 million jobs, they missed in their survey analysis by 0.5%. If Donald Trump were accurate in what he said 99.5% of the time, this would be a very, very different country and a very, very different presidential race. Now, this 818,000 jobs revision is a meaningful and important piece of information. And what it tells us is that we thought we had a great labor market. We only had a good labor market. It's not a disaster. It doesn't mean a recession is coming. It doesn't mean that people are, lining up and selling apples in the street like during the Great Depression. It's nothing like that. We are in need of a little bit of juice from the Federal Reserve. They need to cut rates by, my view is at least 50 basis points, not merely because that will juice the economy and get more jobs into the economy, but also they need to send a signal that inflation is not the only thing they care about. Inflation is almost at target. By some measures, it is at their policy target. But they need to send a signal that jobs also matter. Unemployment also matters. They have a dual mandate. And right now, they're sending a signal, well, we're not concerned enough about jobs. And these numbers just reinforce that.
But that dual mandate, that's a big deal. We heard weeks ago from Jay Powell that the job market is once again in balance. So doesn't that trigger the alarm to start cutting rates?
I don't want to use the word alarm because I'm not an alarmist, and I don't think that this is a crisis situation. It suggests that they need to make a revision, and probably they're a little bit too late. They probably waited a quarter or two too long. But in fairness to them, they didn't have these numbers any earlier than the rest of us. They didn't know that we were growing at an average, the job market was growing at an average rate of around 170,000 instead of around 220,000. That is a meaningful difference. Remember, there's somewhere between 75 and 150,000 workers entering the labor market every month on average. So the difference between having 75 or 100,000 extra jobs, tightening up the labor market, driving wages up, creating more opportunity for workers who maybe have been left out of the labor market for a long time, and only having a little bit, 10,000, 20,000, that is a meaningful difference. So I think Chairman Powell not apologizing, but sending a signal that they know they need to move, and I expect they will move in September.
All right, Seth Harris, who advised this administration on labor. Thank you so much for joining us here in Chicago. We appreciate your time, sir. And as we continue this conversation about the economy, it is also worth discussing some of the economic proposals that have been put forward by Vice President Kamala Harris, including what she would like to do on price gouging. This is something that Senator Ron Wyden, who chairs the Senate Finance Committee, spoke about with our colleague Anne-Marie Hordern earlier today here in Chicago.
I'm glad you asked about this because I think the Vice President is moving in the right direction. We believe in markets. I'm the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. I believe in markets. I believe in marketplace forces. That's always the best way to go. But when markets are breaking down, you need some guardrails. And that is what the Vice President, is talking about. Now, I'm going to be going home. I'm going to be flying all night to have town hall meetings in rural Oregon. You know what folks are going to ask me about? They're going to ask me about the biggest grocery merger in American history. Kroger's and Albertsons.
Do you think it should go through?
Well, what I've said is I think we ought to kind of take a time out. I've been part of the effort with Congresswoman Jayapal to say, let's have kind of a recall on this decision for a while and think through how to come up with a fair agreement. But what I can tell you is when, milk is $4 a gallon in a lot of places, meat $10 a pound, a lot of people are saying, get us a fair shake. And the concentration and consolidation we've seen in these food markets, I think is what we got to deal with.
And while economic policy has been a target of Republicans targeting Democrats with that issue, we've seen other issues come up consistently as well, including as we sit here in the city of Chicago on the issue of crime and security. And we're joined now by former mayor of another big city. The former mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, is here with us on Bloomberg Television and radio. Great to see you in Chicago, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. We actually spoke with Mayor Eric Adams yesterday about this issue of crime and what the proper messaging around this is for the Democratic Party right now. Kamala Harris, of course, is a former prosecutor. It would be easy for her to present a tough on crime image theoretically. Republicans, though, seem to disagree. There's also the risk that you alienate some within the Democratic Party if you're too tough seeming. So how do you walk the line here?
Well, the first thing is to put in context. Look, we had a horrible situation all over the country with gun violence during COVID. That is receding everywhere. So the first thing is to remind people we're moving in the right direction. Second, I think the fact that she's a prosecutor is a huge plus. I'm a progressive, but I sure want to see people who have committed a crime pay the consequences. I think most people, whether right-wing or left-wing, feel the same way. So you can talk about a fair criminal justice system, but also talk about consequences for those who've done wrong. I think that's the sweet spot. I think she can do that as a prosecutor, but also someone who clearly cares about fairness, non-discrimination, respect for everybody. Also talking about the right relationship between police and community. One of the things we did in New York was we worked to bring police and community closer together, more dialogue, more mutual respect. That serves everyone. So I think Democrats should not run from the issue. Bluntly, some Democrats have been a little afraid to talk about crime. And that's a mistake. Then it's one hand clapping. Then it looks like the Republicans are the only ones that care. She should talk about it and embrace that good history she has on this issue.
Well, this campaign is being framed as the former prosecutor versus convicted felon.
Yep.
That's pretty stark. Do Democrats run the risk of being too far ahead on this, leaning too far into the tough guy routine? Is Kamala Harris going to talk about her role as a prosecutor tonight or her role as a uniter?
I think she will talk about her role as a prosecutor because it's necessary for people to understand who she is. It's necessary to make that contrast because let's be blunt, we've never had a convicted felon running for president of the United States to begin with. And we know that there's a lot of Americans, including independents and Republicans, who take very seriously trial by jury. It wasn't a judge who decided that. It was 12 individual Americans who had to be unanimous on 34 counts and did it in less than a day. That matters to a lot of voters. She has to draw that contrast. But at the same time, what people care about the most, obviously, is the most fundamental kitchen table issues. That's why she's going to talk about addressing inflation and price gouging. She's going to talk about healthcare costs and prescription drugs and a woman's right to choose, which I think still is the dominant issue in ways that are not being recognized by a lot of the political class and the pollsters. Because voting is emotional, it's personal. Nothing can be more personal than control over your own body. And she wins the election, in my view, because of the women of America, particularly suburban women in those swing states saying, in the end, I need someone on my side in the White House because I don't like what's going on. That's how she wins.
Well, and certainly we are seeing some more energy from these groups than we were when Biden was still at the top of the ticket. And I'm asking you this not just as a former mayor, but as someone who ran for president yourself. How does she sustain the momentum, the energy that's being felt here in Chicago for the next 2.5 months to get to November? Do you worry this is a flame that could burn out too fast?
I worry not so much about that as I worry about people taking their foot off the gas. You know, I think Michelle Obama's message was really clear. Everyone's got to assume they have a role to play. I think what Tim Walz said was great. You know, call your family members, you know, call your in-laws. You know, it's got to be personal. So I do think there's a danger that if you don't have this kind of amazing kind of constant reinforcement, people go to sleep a little bit. It's going to be a very tough campaign. I loved it. You know, we're all searching for that perfect analogy, and Tim Walz just never fails to be amazing. He says, yeah, we're down a field goal, but we got the ball, right? We got the ball, and we're on the offensive. It's perfect, because we do have the ball. What's happened is Trump, by nature of not coming up with a positive message or a vision, and just sort of essentially living in grievance, has given the ball to Kamala Harris. He's given her the opportunity to stay on the offensive. She has to sustain that with new ideas. There's a lot more we have to hear about where she's going to take us. And that each time will create energy. But also everyone who believes in her, we got work to do.
Well, Mayor, it's great to see you.
Good to see you.
For spending some time with us while you're here in Chicago. Enjoy the big show tonight. I'm assuming you're in the hall.
It's going to be amazing.
You know who's introducing Kamala Harris?
I don't.
We're asking
Tell me.
everybody.
Have you
Tell
heard
me.
about Beyonce?
I thought
Text
you
us when
knew.
we find out.
I thought you knew.
It's Beyonce. Everyone knows. They just haven't come out with it yet.
Yeah.
Former Mayor Bill de Blasio, thank you so much for being with us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've got a lot more coming up in the next hour. Of course, live from Chicago as we're bringing voices from the Democratic National Convention and from Republicans as well. We'll be joined by Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin at the table, former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, Bharat Ramamurthy, and of course our signature panel. You can't do this without Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. It's all ahead right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
of politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
From the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We are here for day 4, turning in to night 4. And this is the night that Kamala Harris will officially accept the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. This will perhaps be, Joe, the biggest moment in her political career thus far.
It's safe to say that it will be, and the number of eyeballs watching this speech will also likely be a new high for Kamala Harris as she prepares to speak to not only the thousands of delegates in the room here at the United Center in Chicago, Kaylee, but much more importantly, the millions of people at home. About 20 million people, according to Nielsen, watched Joe Biden's speech on Monday night, and it will likely be a much higher number this evening. She wasn't in the hall last evening, reportedly stayed in the hotel, going over the speech, getting ready for the final preparations here as Tim Walz had his moments in the sun.
Yeah, and his moments were briefer than what we heard from some other speakers last night. He spoke for roughly 15 minutes, but of course he did so after prime time was technically over. I believe he took the stage at 11:22 p.m. Eastern time. And the question is also going to be for those running the convention today, can they get the nominee's speech, Harris's speech, into those primetime hours? Are we going to see a more tightly run ship tonight, as we still don't know how many other speakers will be coming before her or who they might be, Jim?
Yeah, I'd get ready for some surprises. Oprah Winfrey was the big surprise last night. I know Beyonce's got to be in town, right? So there's much more, I'm sure, that we're going to learn over the course of this day. And Bloomberg's Laura Davison and Hadriana Lowenkron help us with that, covering the campaign and this convention here in Chicago. It's great to see both of you here. My gosh, is that what we're in for, a Beyonce show tonight?
Who knows? At this point, we're really prepared for any and everything.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, there were some surprises. I do think it'll be interesting. This is Harris's chance, not just her introduction to talk about maybe some policy, maybe give some more detail from what we have seen in the past. We know she unveiled some economic policy earlier, but also the chance to tell her own story, her own identity, which we know has been under attack by Trump. So it's the chance to, again, introduce herself to the voters, introduce herself to the public, as we know Walz did last night.
I just feel like I do need to say, after whispering Beyonce in an interesting way to our Bloomberg and TV radio and TV audiences, we don't actually know that Beyonce is coming. And if she does come, this will be one of the best kept secrets in American politics if this thing doesn't leak. But we will all find out together tonight. We'll also find out what exactly, to Hadriana's point, Laura, Kamala Harris is going to say, to what extent she's going to balance her own resume and all about her versus about Donald Trump, the man she is running against, versus the actual policy